Welcome to the fifth and final installment of economic videos related to the production possibilities model. This video will introduce students to applications of the production possibilities model and the economic lessons of the model beyond exercises previously covered. And we will also discuss at the end of this video an economic model referred to as the circular flow diagram. There will be two specific applications of the economic lessons of the production possibility model beyond our previous examination of these lessons. The first will be related to the trade-off between military output and civilian output, the old guns versus butter debate. The second application will involve what is known as the personal production possibility curve. This graph will represent the trade-off between military output and civilian production. So we're going to construct a production possibility frontier, a curve which represents potential output of military goods versus civilian goods. Notice on the vertical axis we have capital goods and consumer goods on the same y-axis. Our previous analysis of the entire economy graphed capital goods on the vertical and consumer goods on the horizontal. Now we have lumped all potential civilian production on the vertical axis, on the y-axis. Likewise, on the horizontal axis, we now have potential military production for a country. We construct our production possibility frontier. Notice the production possibility frontier has concavity. As soon as we notice that a production possibility curve is in fact curved, it's not straight, it has concavity, it's not linear, we know that this production possibility curve demonstrates what economists refer to as increasing opportunity cost. In other words, as we want more civilian goods, it will cost us more military goods than the previous marginal choice. The reason for the law of increasing opportunity cost, remember from previous video, the economic resources that are necessary to produce military output versus civilian output are not readily adaptable or shiftable between these two vastly different types of production. Let's discuss what's taking place at point A as an apple and point B as in boy. At A as an apple, society has decided not to even arm its country. There's absolutely no level of resources allocated towards military production. No guns, all butter at A as an apple. At B as in boy, the opposite is taking place. There are no machines, equipment, tools, and factories that we would refer to as capital goods, nor is there any food, shelter, and clothing we refer to as consumer goods. So B means all land, capital, and labor resources are used to produce military outputs. Similar to our previous analysis, neither A as in apple nor B as in boy would be allocatively efficient. We would want some level of military spending to defend the country. Therefore, point A, 100% of all resources allocated to civilian production would not be the mix of output which maximizes utility for society, nor would B refer to an allocatively efficient outcome. We would not want to choose B on the curve because obviously we need food, shelter, clothing, and capital good production. Let's look at what we would refer to as the 50-50 split, point X on the curve. What is happening at point X in terms of allocation of economic resources and therefore production of civilian output versus military goods? At point X, half of the nation's resources are allocated to military production. So half of the land, capital, labor, and skills of the entrepreneur are dedicated to guns and tanks and bombs and drones and ships and nuclear warheads. The other 50% of resources are used to produce consumer goods and capital goods. Now, here is the part of the lecture when students must participate. I'm going to ask a question, and I will make sure it's formulated in such a manner that students understand what the question is proposing. Then I will ask you to pause the video before moving forward And then you will find out the answer to the question after you have decided for yourself where you think the United States currently resides on this production possibility frontier. So, quick review. At point A, society is producing no military output, all civilian production. At point B, all military output, no civilian production. At point X, a 50-50 split. This is your job. Draw this production possibility frontier into your notebook. Label point A, point X, and point B. Make sure you identify that A represents 100% civilian production, B represents 100% military production, and X represents a 50-50 split, resources allocated evenly between military output and civilian output. After you've constructed the production possibility frontier into your notebook, put a point on the curve that you believe represents the USA current situation. In other words, if you think that 70% of our economic output is dedicated to military production, you would label a point somewhere between X and B, not quite 50-50 in between X and B, right? If you believe 75% of the total economic production of the nation was military production, then you would pick a point exactly between X and B. Right? If, on the other hand, you believe that military production or military output only represents 25% of our nation's total production, you would pick a point equidistant between A as an apple and X as an X-ray. At that level of production, 75% civilian output, 25% military production. So think about this for a moment, really asking you this question: what percentage of total U.S. GDP is currently dedicated to military production? So put a point on the curve that you believe represents the situation in the good old US of A today in terms of guns versus butter. I assume you have labeled the production possibility frontier you constructed in your notebook, and you're now ready to discuss the answer. This chart displays military output as a percentage of total GDP, as a percentage of total economic output from 1940 through 2003. So where do you think the United States lies in terms of the trade-off between military output and civilian outputs? Okay, time for the big reveal. Most students of economics wrongfully assume that a large percentage of our economic output is dedicated to military production. When I have asked this same question in a class full of 35 people, generally receive answers of upwards of 50%, 60%, 70% of the U.S. economy is dedicated to military outputs. Reality is much different. Look at the period of time between 1940 and 1946. Notice there was a huge expansion in military production over this particular period under consideration because that was World War II. Literally, human beings in the United States, citizens of our great country, working 24/7, 365 in factories to produce military output for the war effort. But notice that even during this time when the United States engaged in a global conflict where never before had so much of our nation's production been allocated to military output, military production still only represented 40% of total GDP. You can also see how quickly the United States readjusted to a peacetime economy after 1945, where military output fell back to about 4% of total GDP. Notice if you look and say post-World War II, 1946, military output only 4% of GDP. Today, the answer is just about the same. Military production as a percentage of the total economic output of the United States is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.6%. You can also see that over time, the United States has reallocated resources towards military production during times of military conflict. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Reagan buildup, that was the Cold War. Most of the spending on military output was nuclear armament in an effort to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan entered office with the philosophy that the United States was far more equipped to engage in an arms race economically than our Soviet counterparts. The gamble did pay off. The United States increased military spending dramatically, but it ultimately bankrupted the Soviet Union. Notice at the end of the Cold War, military spending as a percentage of GDP dropped significantly. If you consider the Clinton years, which was 1992 through 2000, because our nation's leadership viewed the world as a much more peaceful place, there was a decrease in the standing army by over 1 million soldiers, and military spending was cut dramatically as we no longer felt the threat of the Soviet Union on our doorstep. In addition to analyzing military spending as a percentage of total economic output for the United States, we can perform the same exercise for a host of countries. That's what this chart demonstrates to us, and it helps us make some economic conclusions about the cost of military spending. Notice this is an older chart, so when you identify the country third from the right, Iraq, it states that in Iraq, 7.6% of total economic production is dedicated to military output. This was the economic reality under the regime of Saddam Hussein, who was toppled in the early 2000s after the Second Gulf War. As a percentage of GDP, military spending has declined significantly in Iraq after the topple of the Hussein regime, right? If you look and say, wow, look at some of the other modern industrialized countries and some trading partners of the United States, Mexico, Canada, Japan, Germany, China, as a percentage of total economic production, their military spending is quite low. Again, the United States military output as a percentage of total economic activity is somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5%. In this chart it says 3.1. It has increased slightly since this particular chart was constructed. Let's evaluate the country on the far right, North Korea. You understand that North Korea is a dictatorship, and the citizens of this country are not allowed to participate in democratically electing their leaders. North Korea demonstrates extremely important economic idea that scarcity, choices, and costs, the very heart and soul of our economic thinking. Limited or scarce resources forces society to make choices. Every choice involves a cost. If North Korea is going to allocate nearly 15% of its total production to military outputs, the cost is starving citizens in this country and lack of economic development in other parts of the economy, specifically civilian industry. If you fly over the Korean island at night, there's a easy demarcation that's made between North Korea and South Korea because there is no electricity in large parts of North Korea, and therefore the country completely dark after 9:30 p.m. Choices, trade-offs, and costs. Leadership over allocating resources to military production means starving citizens in the country of North Korea. Were it not for the generosity of many South Koreans, the economic woes of North Korea would be far worse. This information provided by Forbes displays military expenditures as a percentage of GDP for suggested nations. It's more up-to-date information from 2014. Saudi Arabia, 10.4% of the budget is dedicated to military output. Right, in the United States, 3.5%, in Russia, 4.5%, Israel, 5.2%. Doing some research on the good old internet in 2019, North Korea actually new estimates that between 22 and 24% of total GDP is military output. China is the interesting country to analyze here because officially military spending as a percentage of total output is 2.1% in China. However, the official numbers might be off because the reported data versus the actual data might not actually equal in a country like China where information is not always truthfully disseminated. After discussing the application of the economic lessons of the production possibility models to the trade-off between civilian output and military production, we will move forward with how the economic rationale of the production possibility curve can be applied to what is known as the personal production possibility frontier, or the PPC, the personal production possibility curve. Economists build models on what is referred to as generalizations, tendencies of the norm. Remember, economists don't have the luxury of scientists operating in a laboratory where they would expect the same exact results every time they run an experiment. Economists are dealing with human beings in the everyday business of life. To construct a reasonable approximation of human behavior, economists have to employ what is called generalizations or tendencies of the norm. In other words, if 9 out of 10 people act in a certain way, we would say that's good enough data, that's good enough tendencies to build a model. Why is this generalization assumption important to our personal production possibility curve? We're going to assume that in the course of, or over the course of a 24-hour day, that on average human beings sleep 8 hours. So on average people sleep 8 hours, which therefore leaves 16 waking hours. So constructing our production possibility frontier, we notice that the 16 waking hours could be dedicated either to work on the vertical axis, measured in hours, or all 16 hours could be dedicated to leisure time. Notice the shape of the production possibility frontier. Because we are measuring the trade-off of one person's activity between work-related functions and leisure activities, we have constant cost along the curve, a straight production possibility frontier, because this is one person who can easily shift between leisure activities and work activities. Let's discuss the personal production possibility frontier in more detail by labeling a few points on a curve and discussing what's taking place at each one of these points, and then discussing the idea of implications of choices, trade-offs, and costs. So again, at point W, which means work, the individual is not dedicating any of their day to leisure activities. This person, woman or man, is working all 16 waking hours. At point L as in leisure, or some might say L as in lazy, this person is not engaging in any occupational activity, no work, just play. Point E as in even, in the middle of our production possibility frontier, represents an equal distribution of the 8 hours to work and 8 hours to leisure, therefore a total of 16 hours, equally distributed between occupational activities and fun and games. We would rightfully assume that most people will operate somewhere around point E as in even. In February 2020, little research reveals that the average work week in the United States is approximately just under 35 hours per week, right? So during your Monday through Friday work week, it's a rightful assumption that most people do dedicate approximately 8 hours of their waking existence to work, and the remainder of their time we will assume that they dedicate to leisure activities. Henry Ford, who obviously started the Ford Motor Company, rightfully identified the need for people to have more leisure activity in their lives. He correctly predicted that productivity in his factories would increase if he reduced the number of working days in a week from 6 to 5 and reduced working hours from 48 to 40. Things haven't changed much since the time of Henry Ford. Most businesses operate on a 40-hour work week. All right, so we know what's going on at point W. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. At L, all laziness makes Laura a unproductive individual who doesn't really earn any money, right? Well, let's look at point I as in industrious and point F as in fun. At point I, an individual has decided they're going to dedicate more of their waking hours to work. 12 hours to work, only 4 hours to leisure activities. At point F, the opposite is taking place. That is to say, this person desires to work only 4 hours a day and therefore is participating in leisure activities for 12 hours per day. I think of the Adam Sandler movie Big Daddy, where he worked at the as a toll booth taker and just worked enough to pay his bills. That might be somebody who's only working 4 hours per day. So, what is the value of the personal production possibility frontier for an individual, and how does this apply to real life and real life thinking? The first application of the personal production possibility frontier revisits full employment and the idea of using all available resources as a measure of economic efficiency. Economists would argue that any point along the curve, the personal production possibility frontier, represents full use of all 16 waking hours. It could be easily argued that any hour spent engaged in occupational responsibilities represents efficient use of waking hours. However, one could call into question, how do we spend our leisure time? Perhaps it may be in the best interest of an individual to make a list of how waking hours are spent and if hours are literally wasted. In other words, could it be possible that a person is operating inside of their production possibility frontier? Now, of course, it might be impossible every day to be on your game, to exercise and read and efficiently engage with members of your family and friends and to study for an advanced degree. You can make a whole list of how time can be spent, but it would be sad to evaluate an individual's personal production possibility frontier and decide that the person is operating inside the curve and literally wasting some of their waking hours. Remember, anywhere inside the curve is attainable but inefficient, and in this case, an inefficient expenditure of human time. Something to think about as far as your own decision-making process, how you do spend your leisure hours. The next application of the personal production possibility frontier re-examines the trade-off between work and leisure. Assume we start at point E as an even, 8 hours of work per day, 8 hours of leisure per day. What is the opportunity cost of an additional hour of work? Well, it's less time to engage in personal leisure activities. But a better question might say, what is the financial potential of allocating 1 additional hour per day towards work and 1 fewer hours a day to leisure activities? We will use a time value of money calculator to exhibit and examine this particular question in more detail. Now let's demonstrate quantitatively the increase in efficiency an individual can assume to generate by shifting waking hours away from leisure time into work-related activities. Less play, more occupational activity. How does this play out over time? Let's assume for simplicity again that the person under consideration decides to work 9 hours per day as opposed to 8 hours per day. So an additional 5 working hours per week if the person is working a 5-day Monday through Friday work week. Let's also assume that the after-tax income generated by this person is $20. So therefore the additional disposable income generated by the extra work hours is $100 after taxes. So fewer hours for play, more hours for work, fewer leisure activity hours, 5 additional work hours, $100 in additional disposable income. Now let's assume that this person under consideration takes the extra $100 per week or $400 per month and invests it into an S&P 500 index fund. So for simplicity, to save time here, the S&P 500 is the largest 500 corporations traded in the United States by market capitalization, all the big companies that you heard of. It's easy for individuals to purchase an S&P 500 index. E-Trade, Ameritrade, Scottrade, Robinhood, all these brokerage firms allow people to buy this index. Its ticker symbol is the SPY at absolutely no cost. There's not even a commission to purchase it anymore. So this person puts to work $400 per month buying the SPY ETF, the S&P 500 index. So that's where the payment comes from on this slide. You see, the present value means they start with no money. Payments minus $400. They're putting $400 into this fund every month. We're going to assume that they have an average annual rate of return of 7%, which is a bit modest. Most financial advisors use 8%. The periods, 120 periods, that means 10 times 12. This is 10 years, right? 12 months in a year, 10 years, 120 periods. The money is compounded monthly. By working one extra hour a day and putting the money to work for themselves in this S&P 500 index fund, the person saves nearly $70,000 over the course of 10 years. Now you can see the opportunity cost of additional leisure hours in monetary terms. If you present the idea to students in these terms, it makes a great deal of sense to work one extra hour. This is especially true when people are young and they have lots of energy, and an additional work hour may not be that much to ask. It is also easier for people who obviously don't have family responsibilities at home, such as taking care of children. So if you are free of those responsibilities, it may be a good idea to work a little bit more, engage in a little bit fewer leisure activities, and put the money to work, and therefore accrue a nice amount of savings over a 10-year period. This economics video emphasized application of the production possibility model beyond previous examples. In the video, we discussed a macroeconomic application of the production possibility model by discussing the trade-off between military output and civilian production. Next, we introduced the personal production possibility curve and examined the trade-off between leisure time and work activities. We're going to finalize this video by introducing a new model referred to as the circular flow model. This is a good position to stop because it is a perfect transition into our next area of study, that is markets and market economics. This is the simple circular flow model. For the time being, we're going to ignore government. Identify the market participants. On the left, we have businesses. On the right, we have households. This is just the private sector. In this simple circular flow model, there are two types of markets: resource markets and product markets. Resource market, land, capital, labor, skills of the entrepreneur. Product market, the products and services that all human beings desire to purchase. There are two types of flows in this circular flow model. We can look at the money flow, which is the outlined by the black curves circulating around the model, or we can look at the physical flow of resources and goods and services, the inside orange track of the model. Let's discuss first the black money flow, and we will begin by talking about what takes place in the resource market. In the resource market, buyers are businesses. Again, in the resource market, businesses are the purchasers of resources. In free market capitalism, under a system of laissez-faire market capitalism, we have private ownership of economic resources. In the resource market, households are the sellers of the economic resources. So businesses make expenditures in the resource market. Follow the black line from businesses, the curve back to the green resource market. These are referred to as cost of production. Expenditures by businesses generate income for households. Households sell resources in the resource market and receive income. Now remember, land receives rent, capital receives interest, labor receives wages, and if successful, entrepreneurs receive profits. Students might be a bit confused on private ownership of economic resources. It's readily apparent that if an individual or family owns a business, that they own the capital and land associated with that business. But in most situations, households own economic resources indirectly through stock ownership of corporations. 80% of economic activity in the United States is associated with corporate form of business. Most of these are publicly traded companies. So households ultimately own resources either directly or indirectly through stock ownership. Ask yourself a question: why do people work? Income generated through the sale of resources in the resource market by households ultimately provides money which will become consumption expenditures in the product market. So if you follow the black curve from resource market to households, households selling resources in the resource market generate income. These incomes become consumption expenditures in the product market. Businesses receive revenue by selling goods and services in the product market. And again, the cycle starts as revenue will become cost of production. We could also follow the orange inside track. Households bring inputs to the resource market. Businesses acquire these resources. So inputs become the resources necessary for production of goods and services. Businesses generate goods and services, and households spend on these goods and services, and they make their way into the individual and household's residence. This is the simple circular flow model. Again, for the time being, we're ignoring government, and we are ignoring any activity between businesses, just as a simplified examination of the flow of both money and physical flow through the economy. This concludes the fifth and final production possibility frontier video. Look for you in future videos on the economics of markets and supply and demand.